they can track exactly what's happening. And when a girl deletes multiple selfies, that's the moment they hit her with an advertisement for beauty products. Because they figured if they're deleting multiple selfies, they must be not satisfied with how they look. So let's give them beauty products. 10-year-old girls are going to Sephora to buy skincare products. It's insane. It's because they're on Instagram.
We've all got that person in our family who comes to family gatherings, dinners, goes to parties, but they're not really there. They're on their phone. They're zoned out. Fundamentally, they're elsewhere. What happens to society when so many young people behave like that? When they're never really present in the moment? What does it mean for them? And what does it mean for our culture more broadly? Today's guest has extraordinarily strong views about precisely that. He's probably the most influential social scientist in the world right now. He thinks that social media, mobile phones, constant access to the internet is fundamentally rewiring childhood and remaking what it is to be human in the 21st century. I am so looking forward to this conversation. He is influencing people right across the political divide, and it's a conversation that has to be had. Jonathan Haidt, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you, Aaron. What a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I must say, first impressions, you seem a remarkably serene, calm man, anything but anxious. Were you always this calm, always this relaxed?
Well, my personality has always been kind of calm. I don't get angry easily. I sometimes do get anxious, especially at times when I've been spending more time on social media. But no, in general, I'm a fairly calm person.
That's good to know. So we're talking about this book, The Anxious Generation, and you're a very, very, very powerful authority. And I have to say, I think this might be one of the most important books so far of the 2020s. I read it when it came out in hardback about a year ago, just reread it. I pre-read it a third time, a fourth time. As a new parent, it's invaluable.
How old are your kids?
My daughter is 17 months old. And it's something thank you very much. It's something I really want to talk about later on, actually, is how quickly should they be exposed to TV screens. Let's start right at the top. Really big question.
Okay.
What is childhood and why is it so important for humans?
Yeah. So humans have unusually large brains. And what happens among mammals is it's especially social mammals have larger brains. And those brains take a long time to wire up. Our secret power, we don't have sharp teeth or any other weapons. Our secret power is culture. We have the ability to innovate and then learn. And we are the beneficiaries of literally millions of generations of human innovation. And so childhood is a way to wire up the brain. Now that's kind of dry and technical. It sounds a little better once I say the main way that we do that is through play. All mammals play. Play is a biological imperative. Play is a product of evolution. So we play. And if you have the right kind of play experiences, and it obviously differs at different ages. The first couple of years, you're probably fighting with your daughter. She's learning to use her hands, and she puts things in her mouth, and she's exploring things, and that's sending signals to her brain to wire up all the physical stuff. Next, she's probably just starting on language, and this is your world is just going to light up when you can communicate with her. It just gets all sparkly, and that's a whole nother set. And so, childhood is this long process by which the brain wires up. And of course, if technology hijacks it, so you don't have those experiences, you have different experiences, the outcomes are not good, and that's what the book is about.
And how has childhood changed in the last 15 years?
So childhood certainly changes across the centuries. I don't want to make it sound like, there's a human childhood and then recently everything changed. But even though the surrounding world changes a lot, kids were in the Western world, at least for the since the early Industrial Revolution. I don't know what happened, early part, but kids have they're out in the street. And if you've traveled around the world, wherever you go, you see, it's often just boys, but kids are outside playing, running around, having adventures. And a weird thing happened in the English-speaking countries in the 1990s. If it was just America, then we could say, Americans freaked out about child abduction because America has a lot of crime and we're a weird country and giant country and, crazy stuff comes out of America. So if it was just America, we'd say, it was a response to the crime wave. I grew up during a huge crime wave in the 70s and 80s, but we all played outside. In the 90s, crime plummets But yet that's the decade when we lock up our kids and we say we no longer let them out when they're 7 or 8, which is what it always was. We now keep them in until they're 10 or 11. And even then we supervise them a lot more. So if it was just America, it would just be a weird thing. But the weirdest thing is that the same thing happened in Canada and the UK. Not so much in Australia and New Zealand. They're a few years behind us, but it's happening there now. Didn't happen in Northern Europe. In Northern Europe, they still let their kids out. But that is, in a sense, you could say the book is a tragedy in 2 acts. Act 1 is the loss of the play-based childhood, which happened all across the Anglosphere in the 1990s and into the 2000s. But the kids didn't get depressed then. It's not until the second phase, 2010 to 2015, that's what I call the great rewiring of childhood. That's when everything really turns south.
So that's really interesting because a lot of the case studies you draw upon in the book are the Anglophone countries, UK, US, Canada, Australasia, etc. But it feels like the conclusions are generalizable ones.
They are.
What places do you see which kind of deviate from some of the conclusions we're going to talk about? What countries have mass adoption of social media by young people, and yet we don't see any of these big downsides?
Yeah. Okay, so in this first part of the conversation, we're just going to talk about mental illness as the outcome variable, and which is especially depression and anxiety. It's what's called internalizing disorders. So if we just keep our focus on that, we'll see some variation. Later, I hope we'll get to what I think is actually the bigger thing, which is the destruction of the human ability to pay attention, and that seems to be universal. Okay, but suppose we're back where I was when I started the book. I thought this was going to be a book about social media making girls depressed and anxious, because that's where the evidence was clearest. It wasn't so clear for boys. It wasn't so easy to show that boys who spend a lot of time on social media, they're a little more depressed, that's true, but it's not the big effect that you get for girls. So if we just look at at the sudden plummeting of mental health, the huge sudden increases in anxiety, depression, and self-harm, which is related to anxiety, then what we see is a very sharp elbow around 2012, 2013 in the US. And then in all the Anglophone countries, it's roughly the same. Australia, New Zealand is a year or two later. But here's the interesting thing. We see very much the same pattern in Northern Europe. The one place we don't see it in terms of, most of the world we don't have data for. We don't have long-running studies with good data from Latin America or from most of Asia or Africa. But the countries that have tracked mental health for decades, there is a survey includes Eastern Europe. I guess this goes back to the 90s. There's a survey in Eastern Europe that does not seem to show kids getting more depressed. So that's the exception, is Eastern Europe. And then the other thing I can tell you, which is related, is we're able to go deep in the United States because we have the multiple large studies. We can cut it by gender and religiosity and all sorts of demographic variables. What we find is that the curves are very, very sharp. They're sharper for girls than boys. They're sharper and much bigger for kids, for high school students who say that their families are religious. They're sharper for families that where they say they are not religious. If it's a religious family, they don't go up as much. And interestingly, it's sharpest for those who say that they are liberal, and it's weaker for those who say they're conservative. And so the way we put this together, and this is speculation, but this seems to make sense of these different patterns I just told you about, is that children need to be anchored, rooted in a moral community with a constant sense of right and wrong and constraints that they learn to live within. And I'm a huge fan. My favorite thinker of all time is the sociologist Emil Durkheim, who wrote about the need for constraint in his book Suicide. And he gave us the concept of anomie, or normlessness. And so if you look at all this together, the religious kids, the conservative kids, they are much more rooted, anchored, constrained. Whereas if you're a secular liberal, like the way I grew up, you have lots of freedom. Your parents aren't going to put a lot of rules on you. Everything was open to question. And so before 2012, conservatives were a little happier than liberals, and religious people were a little happier than non-religious people. That's been true for a long time. But at 2012, 2013, that gap gets enormous because it's really the secular liberal kids especially who get washed out to sea and are deep in meaninglessness and anomie, as all they do is just consume social media content.
So this is really interesting because obviously Durkheim's writing, late 19th century?
Early 20th, yeah.
Yeah. And obviously there were huge debates at that time around degeneration, decline of the West, etc. It sounds kind of familiar today with Spengler and Max Nordau and whatnot.
Yeah.
But the point you made there about anomie and normlessness, obviously not new, But the data you draw upon in the book is fascinating for one thing, which is that teenagers and young adults actually see incidence of anxiety falling in the early 2000s, ever so slightly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Before it rockets up again. And I'm looking at that data, and it's quite funny for me because I was 20, 25 or something around then. And so I'm thinking, this was probably the best time in the last 50 years to be entering adulthood. So we have anomie, we have normlessness at the turn of the 21st century, and yet it shifts up. So the sort of critique you've got, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is secular capitalist civilization plus smartphones creates something really unique and quite destructive fundamentally. But perhaps you're underweighting the secular capitalist civilization bit and you're overweighting the mobile phone bit. I mean, that's the criticism you tend to find.
No, this is great. I'm a political centrist. I was always on the left when I was growing up. I was sort of a Bill Clinton Democrat. And once I wrote The Righteous Mind, I became a centrist. And not just because I think the answer is in the middle, but because I feel like you have to listen to the critiques from both sides in order to understand anything. And so I really appreciate what you just said, because, here I teach in a business school. I have a generally positive view of capitalism, but I'm very aware of the extraordinary destructiveness it can make. And if we'd had this talk a few years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, I probably would have been more on the pro-capitalism with all kinds of constraints and problems. But as I hope will come out in the rest of this conversation, I feel like we are looking at something so gigantic, something so almost impossible to conceive of what might be happening to young people around the world, that if it is the business model of these 3 or 4 giant companies that is wrecking childhood, then that really does change what I would think and say about the role of capitalism in the 21st century. We have to figure this out, but right now it's looking pretty frightening.
I often think actually that these big firms, you talk about Meta, Alphabet, etc., what they're doing to concentration kind of undermines the rest of the capacity of the economy to generate returns and generate revenue. And I think there's probably a pro-capitalist argument to be curbing the influence and the reach and the expanse of these businesses. You said that you've changed your mind in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe. What triggered that?
Well, as I said when we first met, knowing that I was going to be talking to you and talking about capitalism, which I haven't talked about in a while, but yet I got a contract to write a book on it in 2014, and I'd moved to NYU Stern from the University of Virginia. I was really fascinated. I didn't know anything about capitalism because I was a very well-educated American, so you never learn anything about capitalism or economics, not much about economics, So I was observing how we have the culture war that I wrote about in The Righteous Mind. The same culture war was sort of applying to the economic domain. Left and right had different views of austerity versus stimulus, different views on regulation, different beliefs about economics. So I spent a couple of years really learning about capitalism, and as a centrist, I'm going to listen to both sides and understand the strengths and the weaknesses. And there's one key quote that I got from a speaker, a philosopher who spoke at NYU in my first year or two. David Schmitz was his name, and he said something like, "A good free market society is one in which you can only get rich by making other people better off." And I think that's the central insight. That's the invisible hand. That's all sorts of things. And that really has stuck with me because to the extent that you have a system where that's true, then I think business it generates most of the surplus value, the comfort, the wealth, and societies that don't have free markets tend not to be very nice places to live. So when you can only get rich by making other people better off, you have the foundation of a very good society. A lot more work needs to be done, but that's going to be the engine that drives prosperity. But then the question is, to what extent is it easy in any given country to get rich while making other people worse off? And with technology early on, we thought these were gifts from the gods, and they unquestionably created massive amounts of value, and our lives are better off in so many ways. And I love technology, and the tech industry is mostly companies that are making our lives better. But what I'm beginning to see is that the net benefit or surplus conveyed on society by especially Instagram, by Meta, Snapchat, and TikTok. Those are the three big ones that are harming kids. Those companies, I think, are making huge amounts of money. While they are making some people better off, but in terms of kids, they are causing harm at such a level that it swamps everything else. And the key thing to keep your eye on here is, what is their business model? A normal business model is you have a good or a service and you sell it to people who want it. And if they don't think it's good for them, they won't buy it. Now, they're addictive substances. That's a different area of markets and exploitation. But the weird business model operating here, which is I think what's wrecking the world in a way, is the advertising-based business model where what you're trying to do is maximize engagement. And that's what the problems mostly flow from. So it's not every tech company at all. There are some tech companies that aren't hurting kids at all. But Meta, Snap, and TikTok seem to have mastered the art of taking all of children's attention. Half of our kids in the United States, I think it's the same in Britain, half of our kids say they're online almost constantly, almost all the time. They always have the phone in their hand. If they're talking to you, they're thinking about what's going on in the phone. So these three companies, plus a few others, and video game companies, I should say, have basically extracted almost all human attention. Now, what is the value of that? Mm-hmm. It's not just the trillions that these companies are worth. It's the future ability of humanity to focus, do anything, control your own lives. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, and I could be wrong, but what I'm beginning to see is that the mental health crisis is only the tip of the iceberg. That what's happening to human attention, I think, is much bigger than the destruction of mental health.
Yeah. So just to synthesize everything you said there, because I think it's a really important point, we tend to lump in the technology companies together. What you're saying is, okay, Amazon may have a ton of negative externalities for mum and pop shops, but there's a net benefit to society in your view, probably Alphabet too. But with these particular firms, TikTok and Meta, Instagram, right, you think those are net negative for society quite significantly?
Yes, that's right. I do, very much so. And there's two reasons to say it. The first is when we look, okay, so obviously Google and Apple are the other gigantic ones, and there's Netflix and there are a few others in the giant. We don't see people coming out of Google saying, okay, I've got all these secret recordings from Google. Look at the terrible things they're doing. Now, obviously, they play hardball and when they need to, but I don't get. Google started with an ethical culture long ago, and I think you can still see it. Google, I don't see signs that it's a predatory company. I can't vouch for all their business practices, but Google makes my life better, makes your life better. So I don't think Google and Apple are to blame in the same way. They're obviously part of the ecosystem, but Meta in particular is the one where we have repeated whistleblowers coming out saying, we have evidence of vast harms to children. Here's what we could do to abet them. Here are the things we could do. Arturo Bejar brought out the extraordinary rates by which teenagers are sexually harassed, or at least approached by strangers on Instagram. As he put it, this is the largest scale sexual harassment to have ever happened. And he came to leadership with a solution. Here, if we just make it easy for people to report, then when we get multiple reports, we can find the people who do this. And over again, they don't do it. So I think, and my group, we, at Anxious Generation, we have a Substack called After Babel. We've put out major documents on TikTok and Snapchat just quoting their own employees, what the lawyers, because there are thousands of dead kids and their parents are suing these companies, and there are 50 attorneys general. They're almost all suing these companies. So what I'm saying is those three companies seem to be predatory. They are the ones that get all the lawsuits from parents. They are the ones that the kids point to as breaking their attention. And interestingly, they are the ones where it appears if you ask the question the right way, you get a huge net negative value. Let me just explain that. One thing economists do is they ask, suppose you could never have tea again. How much would we have to pay you to never have tea? Okay, and then you would say, $1,000, £1,000, and we add that all up. And the net value of tea is, X trillion dollars to society. So that's a common way of doing things. And if you do that, so this economist, Leonardo Burston at the University of Chicago, he and his colleagues, they did this. I think it was students at Chicago. And they said, how much would we have to pay you if, do you use Instagram? Do you use TikTok? They use those two. How much would we have to pay you to go off for a month? And there was some amount of money that they paid. Let's say it was $50 on average. So they would have to be paid to go off. But then they said, okay, now we're trying to do an experiment. We're going to try to get almost everybody to go off for a month. How much would we have to pay you to go off if everybody else goes off? And the answer is -50 or some, I don't know the exact number, but the point is, everyone, I would pay you. I would love to get off of TikTok. My students feel trapped by it. They know it wastes their time. They know it's stupid. They know it's degrading in a lot of ways. But they say they have to stay on because otherwise they won't know the memes. They won't know what people are talking about. They have to stay in the loop. So these three companies have created a trap, and therefore the net value to society is negative and possibly trillions of dollars worth of negative.
It's really interesting you say that, because when Elon Musk was buying then Twitter, now X, I was thinking about the kinds of functionality I'd be willing to pay for. Mm-hmm. One of them was to limit my tweets.
Interesting.
Interesting. I would absolutely pay for a premium service where I could only tweet 5 times a day, because sometimes it becomes compulsive. And you're writing so many tweets because you might be replying to other people. Right, the economy of the tweets is just, it's crazy, right? So that's really, really interesting. You mentioned Instagram Meta as being maybe the primary antagonist here. Have you spoken about this stuff personally to Mark Zuckerberg? Obviously,
Yes.
You're a very prominent individual in this space now.
Yeah, no, I have. But first, I just want to build on your idea. That was such a cool idea. Let me do you one better. Suppose there was a competitor to X, and part of their whole thing was you can only post 5 a day. Everybody can only post 5 a day. That's going to mean the quality is much higher. Oh, and suppose they said, and we do identity authentication. You don't have to post with your real name. Nobody's going to know who you are. But just prove to us that you're a real person in a real country. This wouldn't be a law mandating it, but suppose there was a competitor that had these constraints, that was only real people, and these real people had a limit on how much they could post. And now imagine the ecosystem that would emerge there. Like, wow, I would love to be on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now back to Meta. So I think I mentioned at least one or maybe both of my 2 encounters with Mark Zuckerberg in The Anxious Generation. In August of 2019, Mark Zuckerberg's office reached out to me and asked if they could arrange a talk between me and Mark, a video call. And this was a time when Zuckerberg was like traveling around the US and talking to all kinds of people. So I was very pleased. I was flattered by that. And, I think he knew I was a critic of social media's role. Back then, it was social media and democracy. In 2019, I was just beginning to get the evidence on mental health. I wasn't as confident at first. So I said, okay, great, let's talk. And so we had a Zoom, or whatever their platform was, for 30 or 40 minutes, I think. And we talked about what it's doing to democracy, and we had a bit of a debate. It was friendly. He knows a lot of the academic research. And then I raised the topic of kids, of teen mental health, because I'd written The Coddling the American Mind. We speculated there that the timing is right, but we don't have evidence. But by August of 2019, I was collecting the evidence with Jean Twenge that actually it's not just correlations. There are experiments, there's testimony, there's all sorts of things. This is looking like this is hurting a lot of kids. So I told him about that. And again, we had a kind of a friendly debate. There are a couple of academic articles that he often cites. Andrew Shabilsky is a researcher here at Oxford. So he cited work by Shabilsky. I cited other work, and we sort of went around like that. It was very friendly, and we had a follow-up email correspondence. And then I was invited to his house for dinner because his wife had read The Coddling American Mind and had liked it. And so I was very pleased his office invited me to their house for dinner. It was a really nice dinner, and they were friendly. But we sort of continued, like Mark and I continued the same sort of thing. It was like, an engaged disagreement between knowledgeable people. So that was all great. That was all very interesting. But I did tell him, I said, look, there is emerging evidence. There was growing evidence, certainly of the correlation. There's a lot of evidence that girls who use are heavy users of social media, and especially Instagram. There are a few studies that show it's especially Instagram. That girls are particularly at risk for increased depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, things like that. So, the academics are debating it, but I laid out what I thought was the evidence at the time.
Did he seem like a good person to you? Because you talk in the book about the need for a sort of moral framework and so on, and lots of these companies overtly haven't really been built with that in mind.
Yeah.
How did he come across to you as an individual?
Well, as an individual, he was friendly, and so I can't, I don't want to comment on his personal demeanor. It was a very nice evening, so I'm grateful for that.
Sorry, let me rephrase. Sorry to interrupt. I don't mean a good person. Did he seem like a moral person with a strong, firm sense of right and wrong?
Well, so I'm not going to comment based on my two interactions because there wasn't much to go on there.
Sure.
Like, it really was like, both of us, I think, are very much like, high systemizers, heads in the data. So, that's, that was enjoyable. But where I would be critical is based on so many things I've read. Based on, there's like Talking Back to Facebook Long Ago. There's a book, The Ugly Truth. There's what the whistleblowers brought out, and now the new book, Careless People. All of these paint a similar portrait, which seems to be of a man who is so focused on the success of his company. I do not think he's motivated by money. I don't ever get that sense. But I think he's a very competitive man who loves his company. It's his baby. He has, the corporate structure or the stock owning structure is unusual in that he has almost complete control over what happens. So I think he's very focused on the victory or the success of his company and its subsidiaries. And based on what the whistleblowers say and what the books say, it seems as though whenever people have brought him evidence of harm and told him, here's how we could fix it, if there would be a cost to engagement, he says no. And I don't know that it's always him. They talk about bringing up to leadership, so there may be, I don't know what role others played. But that is what I mostly fault him for, that he's known for a long time, that at least there is evidence, even if he's not sure it's conclusive, there is evidence that it is harming children, I've been saying, at an industrial scale. We're not talking about a few victims. We're talking about possibly millions and millions. And easy fixes have been proposed, and he hasn't done them. So I think he is morally responsible for that.
What are those easy fixes that have been proposed?
So the clearest one, so there are two main whistleblowers. There's Frances Haugen, who had all kinds of suggestions. Now, hers were more about democracy, toning down the super virality, things like limit the number of invitations one can send out to groups, but limit it so that you're in what would be like the bottom 98%, because most of the garbage is sent out by the 1% that are sending out, thousands and thousands. So she had all kinds of design change, and this is very important. Most of us who are in this world of trying to get reform on social media, we're not focused on content moderation. We are not saying, they should clamp down on this or that. We're focused on design. As Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Don't focus on the content, focus on the design. So Frances Haugen brought out all kinds of design changes that could have made it much less toxic to democracy. And they did one of them in I think 2016. They did one where there's something they can turn down or up, essentially, as though it was a lever. I can't remember whether it has to do with the virality or whatever, but it means that either more extreme content gets more grip or less grip. So they can control it, but they don't. So she had a lot of ideas, especially on democracy. She also brought out a lot of stuff about their own studies about how it's harming girls' mental health. But the specific one where they could act on it, they could solve a problem very quickly, is making it easy to report especially for minors, making it easy to report behavior that does not reach the threshold of harassment but is creepy. And so especially Instagram and Snapchat are the main ways that men around the world reach children. Sextortion begins usually on those two platforms. It's insane that any 9-year-old can lie about her age and suddenly be talking to a 40-year-old sex criminal around the world. They could easily put a stop to that, not with content moderation, but by giving everyone an easy button to say something about this feels off. That wouldn't be a reason to kick the person off the platform. But if there are 1,000 of those reports, boom, they're gone. So they could do things like that. And Arturo Bejar, his point was they weren't. And so he actually put it all in a message that he sent by email to all the leadership, as I understand it, so that they couldn't deny that they got it. So they all got this message. And I believe to date, they still have not done what he called for back in 2017, 18, something like that.
Why is Instagram in particular seemingly, and social media generally, again, you put on a ton of data here, why is it so much more damaging when we look at a bunch of metrics, hospitalizations, self-reported feelings of depression, anxiety, etc.? Why is it so much worse for young girls than young boys?
Yeah. So we'll do the boys in a moment, because what I didn't realize, I thought that this whole thing was worse for girls than boys. And if we just look at mental health at age 14, it is. And so we'll get to the boys in a minute, because there the story is addiction. But for the girls, one way to think about it is if you were a business that was, your goal was to trap girls and suck out all of their attention. If your business is dependent on just grabbing them and keeping them, strapped down to a gurney and, with their eyes open and sucking out their attention. If that was your goal, how would you trap them? What would you use as bait? And the definition of a trap is a mechanism by which when the animal's attracted, there's bait. The animal's attracted to something, and then once they grab it, they can't get out. That's what a trap is. And so for girls, the trap is social information. Girls and boys differ on average in terms of what interests them. Differences in ability are not that large. Differences of interest are very large and very consistent. Girls have a more elaborate mental map. They're more interested in who's in, who's out, who knows whose secrets, who's dating whom, who's fighting with whom. Whereas the male brain is literally shifted over a little bit towards autism. This is the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, just higher systemizing, lower empathizing. So when Instagram says, they ping you, do you want to know what so-and-so said about so-and-so, or what so-and-so said about you, or what they said, they tagged you in a photo. So this is irresistible to girls, to teenage girls. And so it uses that that's the bait. Now they go in voluntarily, you might say, but once most of them are in, then no one can leave. Because if you leave, you're cut off. They're all communicating by direct message on Instagram. So that's why it's a trap, it's a sink. It's more addictive to girls than to boys. And then what it does is it ends up, again, not by design, but actually it appears to be by design. I have some quotes in the book. They understand girls' insecurities. They understand the way that emotion gets ahead of the frontal cortex, the self-control. And they understand insecurities. And so if you are making girls compare themselves, girls have always compared themselves to other girls. But if it was just 5 or 10 in your town, or 50, it's different than if it's thousands who are almost all more beautiful than you because of careful editing and filters and all of that. And in fact, one of the most horrible and just typical things brought out by Sarah Wynne Williams, the recent book, Careless People, is that they can track exactly what's happening. And when a girl deletes multiple selfies, that's the moment they hit her with an advertisement for beauty products, because they figured, and this has to, I assume it was done consciously, it must have been done consciously. I don't know if AI could have figured this out, but somebody figured out if they're deleting multiple selfies, they must be not satisfied with how they look. So let's give them beauty products. And so again, just playing on girls' insecurities and making them feel they have to spend their lives making themselves more beautiful, spend their money on more makeup products. 10-year-old girls are going to Sephora to buy skincare products. It's insane. It's because they're on Instagram. So in so many ways, Instagram in particular is causing harm to girls. Oh, and then there's more sexual predation of girls than there is of boys. There's the perfectionism. Girls are more subject to perfectionism, and Instagram really sort of encouraged you to be, have a perfect selfie. So each platform has a different profile of harms. Instagram is the main one to focus on for girls' mental health outcomes. Snap and TikTok have different profiles of harms.
I mean, that sounds like abuse. If somebody was to respond to a young woman doing that by then saying, well, actually, maybe you want this, that's the prompt for me to say, maybe you would like to be more beautiful, we would say that's a nasty thing to say.
It's certainly, yeah.
Bit of an asshole, actually, but it's also borderline abusive.
Well, I would say that if you are hosting children, if you have taken over the social lives of children, if you have deliberately made yourself the place that young people, that children are hanging out, I would say that you have a responsibility, you have a duty of care. And that's one of the great things that happened in the UK was you have the age-appropriate design code, the first in the world that I know of, to assert that these platforms have a duty of care that is different. You can exploit adults much more, adults we think, caveat emptor, adults can make up their own minds. You can use sharp practices on adults that are unethical, but they're not illegal. But children are a different story. We all agree about that. Left, right, and libertarian. Children are different. And these platforms don't act that way. Children are profit-centered, just as with the tobacco companies. They need to get them young, because if they don't get them young, their competitors will get them young and they'll keep them. So abuse isn't exactly the right word. I think exploitation, callousness, and just a general lack of a moral compass at these three companies.
I mean, this gets to the heart of the book, and it's maybe something I slightly disagree with you on, or maybe not, is that you make this big distinction between children and adults, and that this is deeply immoral conduct to be doing it with children. I mean, it's immoral to be doing it with adults as well, or are you focusing on the issue with children precisely because that's going to get buy-in from a wider coalition of people, or do you also have a critique of this stuff happening to adult women? I mean, I find a 30-year-old woman being subject to those dynamics also disgusting, frankly, and I think they should be prohibited. So where do you sit on that?
Yeah. So it's two big reasons. The biggest reason is, as a psychologist, writing this book really focused me on puberty. In fact, I didn't plan to write a chapter on puberty. I planned to just have two chapters on childhood, but I had to add a whole chapter on puberty. The brain is growing. The brain is growing rapidly in the first few years, and then it kind of is full size. But then there's so much tuning. It's all about neural tuning from age 6 through the early 20s. It's not growth. It's just which things wire up. And the key period of neural rewiring is puberty, and especially early puberty. I was also very influenced by the cutoff between millennials and Gen Z, because the millennials got Instagram too when they were in college. It comes out in 2012. That's the year. 2012 is the year where, for the first time, most people in America have a smartphone. In 2010, teens, look at it this way. So suppose you're born in 1995. You're the last year of the millennials. What year were you born, if I may?
84, sadly.
Okay, so you're on the older end. Right, the older end of the millennials. So if you're born in 95, which is the last year of the millennials, you turn 15 in 2010, which means that you went through early puberty. You're still in puberty, but the early part, which is the most sensitive, you went through that with a flip phone or a brick phone, as you say here, or a basic phone. You did not have a smartphone. That's 2012, 2013. You might have gotten a smart, but you went through early puberty with a basic phone, no front-facing camera, no high-speed internet, no Instagram. And your mental health is probably fine. The millennials' mental health is fine. It's a creative generation. They go out, they travel the world, they're starting companies. So the millennials are doing fine. But now suppose we look at a member of Gen Z. Let's take a girl who's born in the year 2000. And what that means is that she turns 15 in 2015. And what that means is that she went through early puberty. She probably got a smartphone with a front-facing camera. She probably got on Instagram when she was 12 or 13. That's when all the girls rush on. And so she went through early puberty on social media, much less human contact, much less shared laughter, much less time in person with friends, much more social comparison. And she is Gen Z, which means her mental health is probably not good. For the girls, we're talking 30, 40% have an anxiety disorder or depression. So there's never been such a sharp cutoff between generations. And my hypothesis in the book is that it's early puberty. The people who got this phone-based lifestyle where they're on 5-10 hours a day, if they got it when they were over 16 or so, their mental health they might be scrambled, but they're not anxious and depressed. Whereas the ones who got it early, they're the ones who are most damaged. So I think there's a sensitive period in early puberty. And there's actually research by Andrew Shabilsky and Amy Orban, and these are two people who are generally skeptical of the link. Their own research, they have a really interesting study where they're able to look at how tight is the correlation between the time you spend on social media and poor mental health. What they find is that for girls, the correlation is highest between 11 and 13 years old. So that seems to be the sensitive period for girls. Boys hit puberty a bit later. For them, it's like 13 to 15 is the most sensitive period for harm. And so I take all of these things as a psychologist and I say, we know puberty is the most sensitive time of brain development. I mean, in utero and the first 2 years are obviously also very important. But in terms of forming your identity, developing self-control, telling a story about yourself, all of this stuff, this is really happening in early puberty. It's the most important period to protect. And what do? That's exactly when we give kids smartphones and social media. In Britain, I guess you have secondary school, what's it called? But basically at 9, 10, and 11, by 11, almost all your kids have smartphones and social media. This is insanity. I mean, unless we have proof that it's safe, and we sure don't, this is complete insanity. And so that's the main reason that I'm focused on kids. Then the secondary reason is, especially as an American, where we have a much stronger libertarian thread in our society, if an adult wants to smoke marijuana every day and risk addiction, I'm not going to say they can't do that. If an adult wants to gamble and blow their family's money, I'm not going to say they can't do that. Obviously, the companies are predatory. I'd like to stop that. And in the same way, if an adult woman wants to spend 5 hours a day on Instagram and make herself depressed, I'm not going to say she can't do that. But I sure as hell am going to say the companies can't do that to my kids. And the way things are set up now, we can't stop them. As long as our kids can get to a browser anywhere in the world, they can create as many accounts as they want. Fake accounts, no verification, no age verification. So that is what makes me mad as hell. And that's what makes me think that these companies, especially those three, are immoral. They own childhood. They have no care for it. They are trashing it, and they just don't seem to care.
I agree with all of that. And it's funny you say about 9, 10, 11. My niece has just got her first smartphone and she's 10 years old. I personally think that's an unwise decision, but I don't want to create a family fracas on our conversation here. I have to say, though, as an older millennial, I actually had an anxiety attack for the first time in 2011, 2012, and it was because of social media and phones.
How so?
So I've always actually been a very mentally resilient person, and I think one of the sort of paradoxes of things like that is that when you're resilient and quite mentally tough, you then take that to the extreme, and what is a self-perceived strength becomes a vulnerability because you exploit it, and you take it too far fundamentally. And long story short, I was just using social media quite extensively. It was part of my PhD as well, looking at social media and social movements.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Just using it a lot. And I started to, for the first time in my life, actually have like heart palpitations and tremors, sleeplessness. And in retrospect, and I had an anxiety attack at one point, and in retrospect, this was being caused by the technology. And for me, I think a combination of that and the housing crisis, so you can't afford rent, you're having to move constantly, and also, this is going to sound incredibly sort of esoteric, high consumption of caffeine.
Okay.
These are the three things that 40, 50 years ago, people in their early to mid-20s probably weren't doing to the same extent in London.
Right, coffees were much smaller than back then.
Right, or tea, as I now drink.
Yeah.
And that in combination, gave me really, really strong anxiety.
Tell me more. What was happening on social media? Were you being criticized? Was it reputation? Yeah, that's what I figured. That happened
Precisely.
to me too,
And it's something I want to talk about in a moment, this idea of conformity and prestige bias and how young people learn. But of course, it's not just young people that, think prestige is super important. And using things like Twitter at the time, you build social networks with strangers fundamentally, and you think their opinions and their views on who you are as a person, you think that matters, which is actually crazy. As an older person now who's 41, I think it's insane. Yeah. But when you're in your mid-20s, you don't think that actually. If all these people are saying you're horrible and nasty, you take it on board. And it's very additive, right? One day you don't notice, 1 week, 1 month. Right. But then after 18 months, actually, it really is wearing you down as a person. So I think it did hit millennials in a slightly different way. Where I think millennials are different is we weren't digital natives, and we have that hinterland of, okay, well, I know this isn't actually real. At a certain point I can step back.
But knowing reality doesn't really shield you. Knowing that something isn't real doesn't really shield you, because these things are really acting on us unconsciously. The most important thing to us, I mean, we can say it's our children, and that is unconsciously, but vying with that is our reputation, is what people think about us. And that is certainly, in many cultures, men will die or risk death to avoid any stain on their honor or any loss of prestige. And so we all live in a prestige economy. Honor cultures are incredibly intense about it. Modern secular cultures are a little less so. We don't fight duels anymore. But I had the same experiences as you. it was times when I've been, when you're being attacked on social media because, we have these evolved sensors to detect, oh, is it just like one person who doesn't like me, or is my reputation shot? And if it's growing and more people are saying it, there's a kind of an unconscious panic alarm that goes off. And so we're adults, and I thought I was tough too. But when I'm being attacked on social media, and it seems to be growing. I also get palpitations and some really intense anxiety, and we're adults, and we're pretty competent, effective adults. Imagine a 12-year-old whose body is changing. They don't know where they fit. They might have no friends or very few friends. So again, the idea that we have let childhood migrate onto what should be adult-only spaces, where literally men are stalking them and algorithms are hooking them. I mean, this should not be close. This should not be a difficult discussion to have. Just children should not be on these platforms. I just want to share the most astonishing stat I've ever found. We just put out a post on Snapchat. We drew from various lawsuits in the United States where in the process of discovery, they got all kinds of quotations from Snapchat employees, internal reports, memos, emails, things like that. So there was there were several internal emails about the very high volume of sextortion that happens on Snapchat. Sextortion is, of course, where someone is tricked into sending a photo. It's usually a teenage boy, tricked into sending a photo of himself that shows his penis. And once he sends that out, the sextortionist has him, and then he reveals, I'm not a sexy girl flirting with you. I'm a sextortion ring based in another country, and unless you pay us 500 pounds, dollars right now, I'm going to share this photo with everyone you know, and I'm going to send it to your parents. How many? Well, I want to ask how many you think. The number is 10,000, and that's not a year. 10,000 reports of sextortion a month. That's what Snapchat was getting 2 or 3 years ago. And there are multiple other emails about dealing with this shit, dealing with this difficult or annoying topic of sextortion. Snapchat is the most perfect platform for strangers to approach children because the messages disappear. There's a quick ad feature, so you're not only talking to people you know, it's constantly suggesting people that you should connect to based on friends of friends. So if someone penetrates a group of kids, then he gets friends of friends. I believe, looking on their platform, I believe they even use spatial. So if you hang out near a school, I'm not sure this is true, I should be careful saying it, but I believe you can be added just by physical proximity, not by connections. My point is, this is a platform that is designed for illegal activity, or at least is designed in ways that are really good for people who want to do something illegal, and that is especially sex and drugs. Most of the deaths, as far as I can tell, are from fentanyl poisoning, because it's now so easy to buy drugs. Of course, when I was a kid, you could buy drugs too, but it was difficult and scary. And on Snapchat, it's just like it's very easy to find the drug pages. They advertise, they'll send to you, they'll deliver to you. And since a lot of the drugs are made in home laboratories where they use fentanyl instead of whatever Percocet or whatever they're supposed to be selling, and the blender isn't even, so some kids get a pill made with a lot of fentanyl and they die. That's what a number of the lawsuits are. So again, this is Snapchat owns childhood, and they let this happen.
And it's frictionless as well, right? I mean, pornography is another one. Pornography's always existed. I don't think we should ban pornography, but I think there should be an amount of friction, which is to say you have to go into a shop, you have to overcome the stigma, you have to buy the magazine. Whereas now anybody can just click on a URL, child or adult, and they can see stuff which was just incomprehensible to my grandfather's generation. What impact is that having on young boys?
Yeah. So if you think about sexual development, you're in an age 7, 8, 9 where sex is kind of disgusting, and it's what Freud called the latency period, and then gradually you find yourself getting a little bit interested. Around 10 or 11 or 12 is usually when the first flashes of interest, whether you're straight or gay, seem to come out. And I remember noticing there was a model, Cheryl Teague. She was a blonde model in the 70s, noticing that she was very beautiful. And it sort of gradually progresses. And at some point, I have no idea when, my best friend and I, when we were 10 or 11, we found somebody had thrown out a porno magazine. It was like Jugs or something it was called. And it was like this, trophy, and we hid it, we divided up, we hid it under our mattresses and things like that. So, we'd seen naked women, but we never saw anal sex up close. We never saw a gangbang with, and we never saw strangling and beating. And you imagine, you imagine a 10, 11, 12-year-old, especially a girl. So if we look at in terms of boys, what do they think is normal? What do they think they're supposed to do? And we know that young men are sometimes choking girls during sex because that's what they saw. They think the girls like it.
I hear that so much.
Yeah. So that's distorting them, the boys' sexual development. And think about girls. There's a huge decline in the number of girls who say they're heterosexual or who say they want children. Well, maybe it's partly because there are many reasons, but maybe it's partly because their exposure to sex is disgusting. Like, why would you, if you're a 12-year-old girl, why would you aspire to this? So I think in so many ways, Gen Z is already the loneliest generation in history, and it's very hard for them to connect. Now, the dating apps make it even harder. And I think pornography is clearly, it's making it much easier for the boys to just check out. There was an article in The Atlantic recently about how many young men are using porn not because they can't get a woman, but they actually prefer it. It's much easier, it's much more erotic. And so, if sex and dating diminish enormously, what future do we have? To say nothing of the happiness loss of people who are going to be having sex with AI or masturbating with their AIs.
So you would say that Gen Z having less sex than millennials,
Much
Gen
less,
X, which we know,
much less,
which was indisputable. You think that's down to pornography primarily?
Oh, well, no. I can't say it down. No, I don't.
Or it's
know.
a variable.
I'm just saying it's a contributor. I'm pretty confident that it's a contributor. And again, this recent article in The Atlantic also made that point. And it stands to reason. In all of these things, whether we're talking about, the ease of buying drugs, the ease of buying pornography, marijuana, everything, part of what's happening, there's a really great book. Oh my God, there's a book that you would love called The Age of Addiction by David Courtwright. It's an analysis of the social history of pleasure. And, originally it was sugar. People, for millions of years, humans wanted fruit and we pick fruit. And then we discovered how to dry it. And then we discover Europe discovers America. You get sugar cane. Oh my God, so things get more and more concentrated. And as it gets more and more concentrated, there's more of a market incentive to concentrate it, sell it, and it becomes more addictive. The marijuana that is smoked now is so much more powerful. It has nothing to do with the marijuana that I smoked in the 70s with my friends. And I just learned you have this horrible thing here. I can't believe this is legal. These little nicotine pouches. Do you know what these are? The kids can buy, and they're legal because they don't have any tobacco. And your laws are such that if there's no tobacco, you can give it to kids. So it's a nicotine pouch. And some of them have as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. So, the concentrations go up and up and up. The addictive power goes up and up and up. The availability goes up and up and up. And before you know it, you have a country with addicted kids. And so, sorry to keep ranting here, but this is really one of the things that I'm most upset about. We talked about the girl story. Now let's shift to the boys story. The boys story, the key thing I'm finding, I didn't know this when I started the book, but the key thing is to keep your eyes on their dopamine circuits. We all talk about dopamine, this, dopamine, that. We all know dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's released when you get a little bit of pleasure, or I should say when you make a little progress towards an evolutionary goal. You get, you bite a potato chip, you master a stage in a video game. So we get a little hit of dopamine, and that doesn't satisfy us. It's not like, that felt great, I'm going to stop now. It's more like, ooh, that felt good. I want to do it again. And your daughter is soon going to be saying that over and over again, because something's exciting. She wants again. And what the story is with boys, I believe, is the number and variety of companies that are now making billions and trillions of dollars by addicting boys is revolting to me. So it begins with the video games. Now, video games are complicated. I'm not saying don't ever let kids play it, but the number of parents I've talked to whose boys are lost to video games. That's all they do. They can't get them off. They have no life. They learn no skills. They get angry when they're taken off. If we're losing 5 to 10% of our boys just to video games, these are boys who are not going to be successful in life unless they can get off quickly. So it starts with the video games, moves on to porn, and that's the most painful one. When you talk to parents whose boys are lost to porn because they're so ashamed of it. But they're, so a lot of boys get addicted to porn. And then there's vaping, tobacco, nicotine, Zyn. Then there's marijuana pens. You kids can, and what they're smoking is like so much more powerful. And this is just by the time they're 15. Now they can also begin to gamble. Not legal, but there are all kinds of roundabout ways that you can begin gambling. And a lot of video games have gambling-like features. Anna Lemke, one of my country's most well-known addiction researchers at Stanford, she says in her book Dopamine Nation that if you have one addiction, if you develop one addiction, you're more subject to all future addictions. Your dopamine circuits are downregulated. That means you're more in a state of withdrawal habitually. If a boy is doing dopamine-related activities for a third of his day, then the other 2/3 are painfully boring, and that includes school. So this, I think, is the boys' story. It's not social media causing boys to be depressed. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing is multiple platforms, especially video games, porn, and then plus nicotine, marijuana, plus crypto investing. And investing has been gamified. Young people, especially I think young men, need to learn how to save, invest, become a provider someday. And instead, we hand them over to gambling companies, and the more they bet, the house always wins. So the more they spend time on sports gambling platforms, the more likely they are to go bankrupt. So this is really the boys' story. If we look at kids at 14, it looks like the girls are doing worse because they're more depressed and anxious. But Gen Z is now turning 30. And if we look in at the 28-year-old young men and women, I think what we're seeing is that the girls are much more likely to have gone to university, graduated university, gotten a job, and be functional in the world. And the boys are substantially more likely to still be living at home playing video games.
What you're describing is us building in addiction to childhood.
Yes.
At every single level.
At every level from the age of 2 or 3, because in the US, 40% of our 2-year-olds have their own iPad.
I couldn't believe that when I read it.
Yeah, 2-year-olds. Yeah, because look, and you guys are no better. I don't have the iPad stats for the UK, but we do have smartphone stats for the UK, and I think it's something like, what was it? It was like, was it 25%? 25% of your 6-year-olds have their own iPhone, have their own smartphone. So in both countries, parents have discovered, I'm busy, I've got a lot to do, you're crying, here, just take the phone, just take the phone, you're happy, I'm happy, I can do my thing. We've all discovered it's effective as a babysitter, but again, so would be morphine.
What you're describing is just so, it's evil, frankly.
It is evil.
I feel bad when I'm with my daughter and I'm just looking at my phone, even quickly if I've got a notification. I feel bad. I know that's bad parenting. I want to talk about television a little bit later on, get some tips from you. But before I do, prestige bias, conformity bias. I just want to nail this down because I think it's really important. You said that young people, children learn through play, but also these two particular biases are how they really structure learning and their entrance into adulthood. What are they and why do they matter so much?
So this is some of the most interesting thinking to come out of evolutionary research. My friend and colleague Joe Henrich at Harvard and his advisors had developed, so the interesting thing is that, of course, Darwinian biological evolution shaped our genome. There's really no doubt about that. But once we became cultural creatures, you have this second strand of evolution, which is culture, and our cultural innovations, like, for example, cooking, well, that then feeds back and changes the way our guts evolve. You don't need such a long intestine if you're cooking your meat. That was an early example. But in all kinds of ways, humans have become a species in which survival isn't to the fastest or even the strongest. It's to the one who learns the best. And so there's a lot of evolution to optimize brains to be the best learners. And so Henrich and his team, I've identified several, but the two that I thought were most relevant here were, one was conformity bias. So so first of all, there's no point in copying your parents. I mean, your child is going to copy you for a few years, but once she's 7 or 8, she's not going to copy you. She's going to copy other kids. And so when she goes to school, no matter what you say, she's going to want to fit in and wear the clothing that fits in. Because it's a pretty good rule. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. You can't really go wrong with that. So we have a strong conformity bias, especially when we're new in a place or we're insecure. And so when you put your kids on social media, they're going to become little conformists, and all the girls are going to dress the same. They're going to pose the same way, sort of influenced by porn. And these are 10-year-old girls who don't know they're doing porn poses, but they'll be, you look at girls on Instagram and the thousands of pictures they put of themselves on Instagram. It's so sad. So they're going to become conformists. So that's bad. We should not encourage them to be conformists to weirdos on the internet. We should encourage them to fit into their local environment. But then more interesting is what they call prestige bias, because you can do better than copying the average. Why copy the average? Why not copy the person who's most prestigious? And so we're very, very good at detecting. When you come into a new situation, we're all very good at detecting who's the one that people look up to, who's the one that people want to be near, who's the one who is just regarded as higher prestige. And our minds will just go right to that, and we're much more likely. That's why kids want to dress like celebrities. That's why celebrity endorsements are worth money. And so prestige bias, until very recently, prestige was gained by actually doing something. You had to be a great basketball player. You had to be a great actress. You had to be a great hunter or basket weaver or storyteller. And that's how you got prestige, was actually doing something that people respected. And then younger people want to be like you. But the guys who built these social media platforms, they hacked the system. And they did it knowingly, intentionally, cleverly, because they created systems on which, how do you get prestige? All that matters is the number. And so, if you have 200,000 followers on Instagram, you are an influencer. Or I don't know what the number is these days, but the point is they hacked it so that the number's always there, the followers, likes, retweets, all that's always there. And young people are just competing to get those numbers up. I just had a conversation with a wonderful British author, young writer, Freya India. She has a Substack called Girls, and she has a book out coming out called Girls. And she's been writing for my Substack also, After About. She's a fantastic writer about what Gen Z girls are going through. So we just had lunch today. She lives here in London. And she was telling me about the many Gen Z. I was asking her, are there other Gen Z writers? Like, what? Give me examples of Gen Z who are like producing things, writing, being creative. And she said she often comes across young people who say they want to be a YouTuber. And they want to have a big YouTube, they want to have a lot of followers. Okay, well, what are you going to talk about? I don't know. I don't know. It's not like there's a thing that they're experts on that people want. Like, that's just the goal, is just get the followers. And that's sad. It's sad when young people are not motivated to do anything. They're just motivated to get followers, and that's how they hack the system.
See, Neil Postman would say all of that. Now, deceased media critic, he would say all of that in regards to television 30, 40, 50 years ago.
He'd say some. Yeah, you're right.
He would have said, look, in a literary culture, Abraham Lincoln can become the president of the United States. In a culture with television, no chance. So a lot of this stuff necessarily isn't that new. You're just saying it's massively intensified, or?
Yes. No, that's a very good point. And the main criticism leveled against me is this is just another moral panic, just like television and video games, early video games and comic books. And history does rhyme. There are many similarities. That's true. And I think, I don't know who coined the phrase famous for being famous, but that came out of the television era. It's not new in the 21st century. So you're right. A lot of this is true. Whenever you get a technological revolution in communication, you get big downstream changes. So, okay, that's definitely true. But here are some of the differences that make this much more pernicious, especially for young people. So television, and here I'm drawing on Robert Putnam's amazing work, Bowling Alone, The Loss of Social Capital. And what Putnam points out is that the combination of television and the automobile had enormous effects in the United States. People stopped being out on their front porch, stopped seeing their neighbors. Life comes inside on the sofa watching the television, and then you're in your car by yourself. But at least watching a television is something that you did with your family and friends. I mean, sometimes we watched alone, but I have a lot of fond memories of watching TV programs with my sisters and with my friends, and we'd play, we'd fight, we'd talk, we'd make jokes. So it still is sociable. Second, the TV was not portable. So it was a thing that you did. There was no way the TV could take up every moment of your day. It couldn't take up the time you're waiting for an elevator. It couldn't take up the time you're sitting on the toilet. It couldn't take up lulls in conversation over lunch with a friend. So TV was much more limited, much more social, and TV told stories that were written by adults that had characters moving through a moral world. So I grew up watching all these little sitcoms that were kind of stupid now that I look back on them. My kids say, Dad, this was stupid. And that's true. But there was always, it was not written by people in my generation. It was not written by other 10-year-olds. It was written by adults from previous generation. And there are elements of good and bad and honesty and moral conflicts. So all of it contributes to our story consumption. Humans are storytelling animals, and television was actually a pretty good way to convey long stories, 25 minutes long for most shows, and then an hour or two for movies. Whereas what are our kids getting today? If you give them a smart device, and this is my main warning to you here with young kids, distinguish between story time, which is good, nothing until she's 3 or 4, no screens other than, FaceTime, no screens till she's 3 or 4 at least. And then later on, if you want to have her watch a movie with you or with a friend or a sibling, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Screens are not automatically bad or dangerous. They can convey stories. What's bad is fragmenting time. Do not give your daughter any fragmenting time until she is 14, minimum. And what I mean by that is if you give them a smart device, a touchscreen device, they're not just going to do one thing. They're going to do multiple things. And they get very, very good. A smart device teaches a child to be an exquisite judge of, is this the most interesting thing I could be doing right now? I've been on this video for 10 seconds already. Not so promising. Let me switch. Oh, this one's better. Oh, yeah, this one's better. So fragmenting time is not social. It's private. It's not stories in a moral world. It's little fragments, 10-second videos, 20-second videos. It mostly ends up with the short videos, and that includes YouTube Shorts. And television didn't customize what it showed for you versus your sister. You both had to watch the same programs. Whereas social media, or a lot of anything with a feed, is getting better and better and better at hooking your child, at hooking you as an individual. So yes, structurally, some of the same things are similar to television. But again, the dose makes the poison. And if you take whatever the changes were from television, you multiply them by 10, that changes a lot of parameters in human development, human society.
So there was that seminal image at the inauguration where you had Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, spouses, etc. Does that worry you, that combination of extraordinary political power alongside big tech and some of these firms which you aren't especially positive about?
Yes, it terrifies me. Sometimes there are ways to get rich without making people better off. There are ways to get rich by harming people. And that's what I think these companies have pioneered ways of doing, of extracting attention and information from people. And these companies, as I've already argued today and in the book, I believe are severely damaging childhood across the Western world. We don't have a lot of data from Asia or Africa, but across the Western world at an industrial scale. And the hopes for regulation were already slim in my country at the federal level, although many states are acting. And when you have the leaders of the wealthiest, most powerful companies on the stage with Donald Trump, who has shown that he will change his mind on tech regulation if one of his donors asks him to, as he did with TikTok. It was his idea that TikTok should be banned because it's a national security threat during his first term. That was his idea. And so the fact that I live in a country in which constraints on power are increasingly being shaken off, in which the U.S. Congress, the Republicans in Congress, seem not capable of doing their job, which is acting as a control on a president who's violating the constitutional order. So what this means is that I think we are approaching something more like the authoritarian countries that have always been our enemies, an authoritarian country in which what matters is loyalty not to the Constitution or the law or the country, but to the leader. So it is extremely frightening to watch my country descend into something that I do not recognize as America.
People have used that word fascism, and I'm not suggesting that that's right or wrong.
Yeah, that's the wrong word.
But I do wonder, this disintegration of attention, clearly attention, the ability to reflect on things properly, the capacity for critical judgment, that is key. That's the cornerstone of effective citizenship.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you erode that and then you combine that with authoritarian tendencies, It does suggest that democracy won't really endure for very long.
That's the fear. That's my fear. That's right. Plato understood the weaknesses of democracy. He said that It's the second worst form of government because it always descends into tyranny, because the people are passionate, easily led astray. A demagogue comes along, speaks to their fears, their tribalism. And the founding fathers read Plato. They knew that, and they designed a careful system to keep a check on that. But they always knew it's fragile, and they were very clear. Those who wrote the Constitution and then argued about it and got it enacted, very clear that it can only work if the people have the corresponding virtues. It doesn't run itself. It's like, think about it as a giant, complicated clock. And if you don't have any clock mechanics, if the people just take it for granted and even throw oranges at it or whatever you want to say, it's not going to work. And I think that as we've been losing social capital and trust, as we've been losing a sense of our history and our traditions, as we've been losing a sense of anything that connects us to the past, I think we are becoming worse and worse clock mechanics. And at least American democracy, I think, is in a very, very dangerous state. All that's left is the Supreme Court to act as a check on power. And someday maybe the Congress will do its job, but there's not much sign of that yet. So that is the great fear, that at the moment of maximum peril for democracy, our people are getting certainly more fragmented, less able to pay attention. Our information ecosystem is becoming less able to find truth. And this is in the first days of AI. As AI makes it easy for everybody to generate whatever they want, we will have no idea what's true in a couple of years. So our people are, in a sense, getting stupider, and this is not just true for young people. The recent FT article brought together studies showing it's adults too. We're all getting less able to think, to read, to learn new things. So we're getting, in a sense, stupider at the same time as AI is getting smarter and as powerful people are getting more powerful. This, to me, is a very frightening combination of trends.
So, final question. What is to be done, as somebody once said? You've got 4 proposals specifically with regards to children and turning this ship around. What are they?
Yeah. So I was originally going to write a book on what social media is doing to democracy, and it was going to be called Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We May Never Again Share. And I thought a lot about what we can do to change the technological environment to make it more conducive to democracy. And that's really hard. And I don't really know what we could do. And if I did, we wouldn't do it, at least not in America, because everything would have been partisan, and anything here would help one side of the. So fortunately, or at least kind of fortunately, I didn't write that book, because I started that book with a chapter on what's happening to kids, what technology is doing to kids. And once I saw especially the graphs, the international graphs, once I saw this is happening around the world, I decided to put off the book on democracy and to just focus on the kids. And what I realized by the end of the book is that the reason we sunk so far so fast, the reason why almost all kids have a smartphone in the UK and the US, and they're all on Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, is because we're all stuck in a set of collective action problems. Every kid has to be on because every other kid is on. And so the way to break out of a collective action trap is with collective action. And so in the book, I propose 4 norms that if we don't all have to do them, but if a lot of us do them, we roll back the phone-based childhood. So the first is no smartphone or iPad, no touchscreen device until a kid is 14. I don't mean they can never use yours. I'm just saying don't give them their own, because it will move to the center of their lives and take over for at least half the kids. So delay that until at least 14. The second rule is no social media until 16. Really, it should be 18. We should recognize these platforms are adult only. They're not appropriate to be putting children in contact with strangers. But my goal was not to specify the best age for an individual. My goal as a social psychologist was to identify what could work as a norm, something that we could all agree to as a floor. And that, I think, is 16 for social media. The third norm is phone-free schools, and this is the one that is happening at lightning speed around the world. Most schools said, we don't allow phone use during class, which, as my kids told me, means you have to hide it in a book or under your desk or go to the bathroom. But what we're urging is that all schools must go phone-free from the time the kids arrive at school. They turn in anything that can send or receive texts. It gets put in a locked pouch or in a phone locker. They get it back at the end of the day. When schools do that, they get miraculous results, and they all say the same thing. We hear laughter in the hallways again. The kids actually come to like it within a couple of weeks, and then much more attentive. And the fourth norm is far more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. Because this is not really a book about social media. My goal here isn't let's all freak out about social media. My goal is let's look at childhood. And that was your first question to me. Let's look at what makes a good childhood, an enjoyable childhood, a healthy childhood, a childhood where you'll become a competent adult. And so it's not just taking away the screens. We have to give our kids back outdoor play, time with other kids. Let them get into an argument. Let them settle it. In America, we're terrified that kids in a playground will get in an argument, so we have to have someone there to intervene. No, stop doing that. So in all the English-speaking countries, we have this problem. Northern Europe, not so much, but they're moving that way from what I hear. They're moving towards the overprotection. So if we do those four things, we restore human childhood. And I think we will then see if any community that does all four, where your kids don't have the phone at all during the day, and nobody's on social media till they're 16, and many more kids are outside having a great time and having adventures and exploring and going and getting pizza or ice cream or whatever, riding their bikes. A world like that, I believe, is one in which we will start to see those extraordinary graphs of mental illness and self-harm begin to come down. I can't say that it'll come all the way back to where they were in 2010, but I think that these are the biggest things we can do to bring down these alarming mental health stats. And if you do all of them combined, it costs about $0. None of these cost anything. You can even do phone-free schools with just envelopes in the front of the room. So I think we need to at least try them. There's no cost to doing these things. People who are experimenting with them are having great results. Let's do them.
Jonathan Haidt, thanks so much for joining us on Downstream.
Aaron, my pleasure. I just want to say people can go to anxiousgeneration.com. We have a lot of resources for parents. I hope you'll check it out. And also my Substack is afterbabble.com. That's where we put a lot of research and commentary, and we have a lot of great writers on it. Thanks so much, Aaron.
My pleasure.